Yeah, so these are the roads and the rails that we have traversed. Many of the migrant construction workers, road construction workers that I have interviewed come from this one district in Jharkhand called the Dumka district. Quite interestingly, this also has a very interesting history, in the sense that in the early 1960s, when Border Roads Organization was looking for road construction workers to work on building roads in the border areas, military personnel would go into Dumka district. At that time, that was in Bihar. It was one of the poorest regions, and with a history of as a sending state in the migration network. So people would migrate from here for dhan. They still do for dhan ki katai, for plant as plantation workers, as daily wage workers elsewhere in the country. So it had this. It had that history, and so they went here, and they initially in the central square they would play the dholki and ask for people to come join the labor force, and eventually that practice stopped. Now they send a letter to a mate who recruits usually each mate is asked to recruit around 40 what they call casual paid laborers, and then they travel by train up until Nagrota, which is one of the recruitment sites. There are several others, but the one that I have visited is Nagrota, and then these laborers are hired and then sent off to different RCCs. So there are road construction sites every 200 or 100 meters on these roads. The roads that you see are in rust. So I've been traveling on the Hindustan-Tibet road, which goes from, let's say, Kinnor into Spiti and parts of Lahore, and the Manali-Leh highway. So these are the journeys that I have, which like in this mobile ethnography, that form part of the mobile ethnography. Also interesting, the Dumka, for example, is so. I mean, the fact that a lot of the migrant road construction workers are coming from Dumka is also highlighted by the fact that in Ladakh, for example, pretty much any laborer, wherever they are from, are generally referred to as Dumka. Like Dumka, come here kind of a narrative. The other group that works is Nepali groups. I will not focus as much on them in this particular presentation. I mean, there are several stories from there also, but we only have so much time. So I'll focus on this journey from Dumka and on the road construction sites for this particular presentation. The next slide, please. Yeah, so the Border Roads Organization is a semi-military organization. It's basically a road construction contractual kind of, you can say, organization. It used to be under the Ministry of Surface Transport, and very recently it has been moved to the Ministry of Defense. And they have been quite instrumental in constructing critical infrastructure in border areas for defense, for example, in the Northeast, in Andamans, in Ladakh, in Kashmir, in Himachal, in the border areas of Himachal, Uttarakhand, all of that. They've also been constructing roads in the troubled interiors such as Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, for increased legibility and mobility of the state. So yet another function. And at international locations for strategic alliances. So they were quite celebrated for their work in Afghanistan, building bridges. They continue to build roads in Bhutan, and they had a serious presence in Nepal, which now, in fact, is a space that China has taken over in terms of helping Nepal with infrastructure and several other things. So that's the kind of, and they consist of the men from what is two units. One is called the General Reserve Engineering Force. These are uniformed but civilian personnel. And then there are military men who go on deputation to the Border Roads Organization. However, alongside all of that, we move on to the next slide. There are more than 100,000 casual paid laborers that Border Roads Organization hires seasonally to construct the border roads. And For me, like what was a glaring invisibility was that there is really no mention of all of these road construction workers who actually do the hard labor of constructing the road, and much of the celebrated discourse surrounding these roads. And I found several couple different kinds, and there are two representative examples that I've put up there. Of discussions about this road, and one is from travelers like middle class or upper class or foreign tourists who go into the upper Himalayas and quite interestingly label this road as roads less traveled, literally, or conquering remote areas, or you'll see in the next few images a very masculine sense of conquering nature, or of, like somehow doing, I mean, yes, brave and courageous things, but there is absolutely no recognition of that somebody built the road and therefore you could go there. On the other hand, even the Border Roads Organization website, basically all the images that have been on the website are of the uniformed personnel of the GREF and the military men. But really, because these labors are seasonal, because they're casual in the sense they're informal sector workers, they get hired uh, every May for 179 days, which is the government's way of not having to pay several benefits, because if you hire them for 180 days, then you will need to pay them benefits. I mean, now also some benefits are paid, and there's a lot of negotiation going on now very interestingly, between the Jharkhand state government and the central government and the Border Roads Organization about benefits, like legitimate benefits to the casual paid labor. Uh, but yeah, so those were some of the things that drive my research, and I've also now in this past year working with a policy think tank called Policy Development Advocacy Group in Jharkhand. Um, that played a very important role in airlifting these casual paid laborers from Ladakh when the lockdown happened, because many of them got stuck there when all the flights and all the other ways of movement were closed. Uh, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so these are the kind of images that I'm referring to, that really show how like there's a sense of bravado, or conquering of Mother Nature. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, on your bikes, and pretty much none of them really recognizes or like that when you tell the history. And like my big concern was that when one tells the history of this very very important road, regionally and in the country, there is like in that history, where are the people who made the road? Like, so that has been something that has driven my project. Next slide, please. Yeah. Also, I'm working on a book, edited collection with Dr. Yafa Trulove at University of Colorado in Boulder. It's titled Gendered Infrastructures. So we are trying to see how, I mean, these are what I have in front of you are very, very explicit connotations of gendered infrastructures, in fact, but infrastructures are gendered in numerous ways, in terms of simple mundane things like access to water also genders infrastructure. When women whose task it is, like on whose head the responsibility ends up falling, have to queue up for ages in order to figure out water for their households, or in during these online classes, who has access to digital infrastructures in a family, is that gendered, not gendered? In these signs you see very explicit kind of thoughts when it comes to looking at roads, very very gendered in their framing. And these are all signs put up by the border roads organizations along the road. They're quite humorous as you walk, as you kind of travel along, but then if you pay more careful attention, they're also very clearly sexist and gendered. So if we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is take you along with me in this journey that I have been doing, and the migrant laborers have been doing now for several. They've been doing it for several decades. For me, let's say 7 years, 7, 8 years. Um, is like I said, so sometime around April, May is when the mates start getting their letters from the Border Roads Organization, authorizing them to bring a certain number of personnel, CPL, to work on the border road. So they go around villages, telling stories of these snow-laden mountains, or offering a loan to the needy family, or in many ways kind of uh, luring or finding or convincing people to come along as laborers on this journey. And for the Jharkhand labor also, it appears as a good opportunity, because there's not much work in the region that they are in. And for many of them, they do own small land, but they don't have access to irrigation water, or they have to buy water from tube wells, people who own tube wells, and for that they need access to a cash economy. Migrant labor, this migrant work actually provides them access to that cash economy, which helps them sustain back home in their villages. So in May, if you see these trains that carry the road construction and other migrant labor from Dumka district, they are hugely crowded. There is, in my next slide, if we can go to the next slide, I have a quote from one of the workers, and Abdul tells me, the names are all changed, by the way. So he tells me that the train was so crowded that those of us who were sitting remained seated, and those who were standing for the 2 day journey, we had to keep standing, and to go to the toilet you had to yell out, and others would carry you above the head like that, like you had to be carried above the rush to the bathroom. And he says even then the bathroom, it is possible that the toilet would be filled with people, so you have to kind of figure out a way to get them out. And the smell of sweat and urine, he says, filled the couch. Now, in ethnographic work, it is very important, I think, to pay attention to these very embodied or very bodily narratives of how bodies negotiate with each other to get to their while getting to the work, and the kind of emotions, and in this case, very sensory perceptions of smells that accompany these journeys. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, then they come to the recruitment site in Nagrota, and when I went there, there were about more than 10,000 people camping right out in the open. So there were each mate had put up one or two tents that you see on the left top picture, or one on the bottom right, where workers from their team would stay. And then there were several of these bigger, larger tents that were put up by the Border Roads Organization. One for taking a picture for the opening their bank account, another one in which they were stripped from waist upwards for a health exam, and the wait was very, very long. In one of my papers, in Gender, Place and Culture, I have argued how this waiting itself becomes kind of like a test. So if you protest, then that you're having to wait, like many of them were waiting for more than 21 days to get recruited, and during that time they're not getting salaries from Border Roads Organization. So that becomes a huge a burden on them to be feeding themselves, or for the maid to feed them, but then charge money from their own, when their salaries, when they get it. And so some of them protested, and many of them protested saying that the officer is perhaps taking bribes to recruit some gangs earlier. This group of mate and the 40 laborers is called a gang than others. And so I found that this waiting was in some ways, so they're being tested for bodily strength, like are these capable hands and legs for breaking rocks and building the roads, but also are they docile bodies that can be disciplined and trained to become productive enough for nation building. So those are the kind of if we go to the next slide, then I have some narratives that make that clearer. Yeah. So this border roads officer whom we met both in the recruitment site, and the same person we met in Ladakh. In fact, when I had asked him about why are the people complaining about taking bribes, he painted a very stereotypical image of them as